Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now that the Prime Minister has laid out her vision for Brexit, skills in diplomacy and negotiation, both from British politicians and civil servants, are at a premium. Obviously, someone forgot to tell that to the Foreign Secretary, who, in comments made in India, appeared to throw shade on François Hollande. Boris Johnson compared the French president to a character in a Second World War movie administering punishment beatings after, apparently in an aide to Hollande, said that Britain shouldn't expect a better trading relationship with the EU after Brexit. Maybe it's a good thing that the Foreign Secretary isn't in Davos, where all the talk is about the manner of Brexit. Our economics editor, Kamal Ahmed, is in the Swiss resort this evening. Kamal, lots of reaction to Theresa May's speech, but what is the news in Davos about it?
Well, I think, Kirsty, today here in Davos, we've really had the sort of day after the party. I think the speech itself, whilst not made here by Theresa May, went down pretty well. There's this idea that at least now we had some certainty that all the nods and winks about being in or out of the single market were over. Theresa May made it very clear that Britain was coming out of the European Union. But today, a little bit of the hangover, the day after. We've had news today from banks here, HSBC based in London and the Swiss bank UBS, that they will be moving jobs or are planning or looking at moving jobs from London onto the European continent because Britain would be out of the single market, and that would mean that some of their services they provide from London would have to be provided from within the European Union. And as you say, Kirsty, noises off from the Foreign Secretary, some negative reactions from France to those comments by Boris Johnson, and really quite a negative thought today from Davos. But don't forget, of course, here, most businesses supported Britain remaining in the European Union. So it's a particular type of cohort you get in Britain, which doesn't mean they speak for the whole of British business. Earlier today, I interviewed the head of the International Monetary Fund, Christine Lagarde, who has been very negative about Brexit in the past. And I started by asking her if the UK leaving the single market would be bad for Britain.
You have to look at all the parameters. You have to look at the monetary policy, the exchange rate, the interests that would be charged. You have to look at the engines for growth, whether that very solid UK consumption, which has held the economy together and better than we had thought, will last. Whether investment, both domestic and from the rest of the world, will persist, or whether there will be a significant reduction. And under what terms the exports will eventually take place between the UK and the rest of the world. What I know for sure is that there is a lot of work to be done in the coming weeks, months, and possibly years.
Risks to economic growth then for Britain and for the European Union through this process?
Uncertainty is always a risk. And we know where we are at the moment. As you pointed out, the UK is still in the European Union, and trade and movement of capitals and operations of banks are still being conducted under the same pattern, under the same rules. What it is, 2 years after the trigger's been pulled, to be defined.
Before the referendum, the IMF was very clear that the results of a Brexit vote, you said yourself, would go from pretty bad to very, very bad. The UK economy has defied expectations, is growing relatively strongly. You've upgraded growth now for 2017. Were you wrong when you said that before the referendum?
I think what has been extraordinary is, number one, the action of the Bank of England, which has sort of instantly taken hold of the situation, decided remedies, and supported the economy in a very, very vigorous and efficient way. What has also been quite remarkable is the behavior of the British consumers, the way in which, with confidence, they've continued to consume and consume and consume. Now, we are still of the view that, particularly on the investment front and on the export or trade front, there is still yet to come. And by that I mean once uncertainty clears, and if people feel that their ability to set up shop in the UK and operate throughout the geographical area that is European Union is not working as well as it did, the investment decision will change. In the same vein, if exports are subject to significant tariffs, restrictions, and so on and so forth, the ability of the UK to activate that trade engine is going to be reduced. So while we have upgraded our forecast for 2017, we have downgraded for 2018.
So pain
we are
delayed,
still,
pain delayed rather than avoided.
We're still of the view that it will not be positive all along and without pain.
Could I just put a quote to you by the Maltese Prime Minister Joseph Muscat, who said that any UK-EU deal necessarily needs to be inferior to membership of the European Union. Do you agree with that?
You know, when you belong to a club, whatever that is, either sports or intellectual or whatever, the members of the club have a degree of affinity and particular terms under which they operate. Somebody outside the club, sports or intellectual or whatever, have a different access, and I think he's referring to that.
So it would be a less good deal for Britain?
It would certainly be different, and if being part of a club is optimizing and leveraging your membership, it would not be as good, yes.
Let's just talk finally about, we're here at Davos, big debate that you've been very closely involved in for many years about equality, about elites, about the way the world operates and economies operate. Does it give you a sense that it's all a little bit ridiculous, that we are speaking here in this resort, we can look out there at business people doing deals, highly rich people? This is just totally out of touch, is it not, with the real world? Even though everyone's talking here about inequality, actually it's just completely out of touch, and it's slightly ridiculous. The world looks at this and thinks, you just don't get it.
You know, I think it was your former Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, who said that it is better to chat than to war. And whether you talk economics or whether you talk military, people have a tendency to confront, to have adversarial debates. And if they are here to talk, to have a dialogue, to confront their views to other people's views who don't necessarily look like them. You have a lot of NGOs that are present here. You have a lot of young leaders. You have a lot of global shapers who are not the ones that you've just portrayed. And there is huge value in that. So easy to criticize and value to be had from people actually confronting their views and trying to make sense of the negative and the positive narratives that abound at the moment.
Our Prime Minister Theresa May has criticised what she calls the citizens of nowhere. Do you think of yourself as a citizen of nowhere?
Oh, absolutely not. You know, what defines your citizenship is your language, your culture, your background, your education, your family roots, where you were born, the smell of the trees in the morning. All those things, they stay with you forever.
But
and
can
you spend
see,
your whole life with it.
But can you see that critics might say, for someone like you, the head of the International Monetary Fund, you know, you live a different life, a different world.
I have to care for far more people than my community. And what I'm trying to do is to help the entire community, as difficult as it is. We have 189 members. Some of them have rock bottom GDP per capita. Others are, you know, sort of 50 times better off. But we have to care for all of them because our mission is stability. And without stability, whether it's in defense terms or in economic terms, you don't build anything.
Christine Lagarde. But what if all the diplomacy and negotiating skills the UK can muster don't get us a trade deal with the EU and we have to fall back on membership of the World Trade Organization? How would that work? In a moment, I'll be speaking to Pascal Lamy, the former director of the WTO. But first, here's our policy editor, Chris Cook.
This week, there's been renewed talk of the prospect that Britain will end up relying on its membership of the World Trade Organization and no other special deals as the basis of its trading relationships with the world.
Theresa May's speech yesterday contained one very big strategic decision. She wants a comprehensive free trade deal between the EU and the UK, quite unlike anything anyone else has. She doesn't want an off-the-shelf option like the Norway model, for example. And that means that that puts more pressure on that 2-year negotiation process. It's more likely we won't reach a deal, or in her terms, we'll take no deal rather than a bad deal. And no deal means operating on WTO terms.
That's usually presented pretty bleakly. The WTO would, for example, force the EU to place 10% tariffs on British car imports. It would mean customs checks on sales to the EU and difficulty for, say, British pharma companies selling drugs into Europe. So why?
To understand the WTO, it may help to know where it came from. The WTO was a body that was only set up in the 1990s, but its roots are in talks that took place in the 1940s. And those talks were themselves aimed at preventing repetition of problems that occurred in the 1930s.
Before the Second World War, there was a trade war. In 1930, the US passed the notorious Smoot-Hawley tariffs, named after the legislators who proposed them, and other countries replied in kind. The WTO's predecessor emerged from talks aiming to stop that from ever happening again. Why then would a body whose founding purpose is to reduce tariffs force the EU to raise tariffs against the UK?
The EU is a member of the WTO and it has no real special deal with the UK at the moment. Then what the WTO will force the EU to do is to treat the UK like it treats any other WTO trade partner, and that would mean increasing tariffs towards the UK.
The idea is to stop tit-for-tat 1930s-style trade war. Unless we cut a proper deal, the EU has to treat us like strangers. And so will places like South Korea, countries with whom we now have trade deals, but via our EU membership. That might seem odd for a free trade body, but the rule set has worked. Average tariffs around the world have fallen from 22% in 1947 to about 5% now. The problem is, these days, modern trade barriers are less likely to be tariffs. It just isn't the 1930s anymore. The modern WTO took its current shape at talks in 1994 in Marrakesh. But while its achievement in reducing tariffs is important and helpful, it hasn't been so good at preventing other sorts of rules and regulations from getting in the way of trade. These so-called non-tariff and technical barriers are now much more important than tariffs.
So if we went to WTO rules, there's no actual provision for cooperation between regulatory agencies, which is really important when you look at the things that the UK is very good at producing. If you look at the pharmaceutical sector, where we're continually producing new innovative drugs, you need to make sure that those drugs are being accepted and approved by regulatory agencies, particularly at the EU level, to be able to put on the market.
The WTO, in short, isn't good at reducing the admin hassle of selling across a border, or stopping local laws or approval processes that might hobble foreign companies. That's why countries strike free trade agreements.
Chris Cook, well, Pascal Lamy is, as a former EU Trade Commissioner, and was the Director General of the World Trade Organization, and he joins us now from Davos. Good evening to you. We'll come on to talk about the WTO possibilities in a moment. But first of all, in July last year, as far as the Brexit negotiations were concerned, you said it would be complex, bumpy and nasty. After Theresa May's speech yesterday, do you still hold that view?
Yes, I still hold that view. It's going to be complex, bumpy and nasty, like any trade negotiation. We know that by experience, unless we invent the first ever trade negotiation in history, which would be a love affair. I don't really believe it can happen.
Except that Theresa May is determined to invent something. She doesn't want, as we talked about a minute ago with Chris Cook, an off-the-shelf deal like Norway. She wants a bold and ambitious free trade agreement with the EU. How do you think that would work?
I think that's what we have to do now that UK has decided to leave the internal market. As you just said in your excellent summary, UK will be a third country like Mexico, like Korea, like Japan. So UK has to negotiate the terms of access to the EU market, and EU has to negotiate the terms of access to the UK market. It's 7 for the size of the EU market to one, which is the size of the UK market. It's going to be complex, long. It's probably a good thing, a better thing than going back to the WTO tariffs, but it will take time, and inevitably trade will be less open than when the UK was a member of the internal market.
They may have to go back to the WTO because obviously, you know, what Christine Lagarde was essentially saying was that actually if you're outside the club, you're not going to get as good a deal as if you were inside the club. No one wants to give Britain such a good deal as they have just now. And I wonder what you think of the idea, you know, we've already heard about HSBC and UBS perhaps shifting to Paris and beyond, that actually certain different areas, for example, financial services and the car industry, might strike separate deals within the EU. What do you think of that?
No, I think there will be no separate deal.
Right.
It's a single undertaking. You have to agree on everything before you agree on anything. And there's no deal which will be a sectoral deal. And this will be toughly negotiated on both sides. As you just said in your program, the main difficulty for the British exporter to the EU continent, whether goods or services, like financial services, for instance, accounting, will be that the UK will have to match EU regulations and standards without having any say on these regulations and standards. That's a big problem for the future.
Now, on the question of how all this operates, because of course we have to, as it were, you know, you trigger Article 50, you negotiate your way out, you separate the laws that exist between the EU and the UK, and then the idea would be that simultaneously you'll do your deal, your fresh deal at the same time. Is that possible, do you think?
No, I don't think it's doable simultaneously. It can start simultaneously, but any trade negotiation of this kind is very complex and will take a long time. So I'm absolutely convinced this is not doable in 2 years.
Two things about that then. It's not doable in 2 years, and yet David Davis, who's our chief negotiator, says he hopes it'll be done by the end of 2018. Two things. You don't think it'll be done by then. Do you think, knowing the complexity of all this, that the UK has a sufficiently high-octane negotiating team?
Very difficult to say. What I know is that, like any other EU member, UK disbanded its trade expertise when it was transferred to the European Union. So they have to reconstitute a whole body of trade experts and trade negotiators. This will inevitably take time, and by the way, be pretty costly, and at least that's what I'm told by my friends in the consulting and the legal business.
Right, so how long, in your estimation, do you think it would take to strike a new deal with the EU?
I don't know of any trade negotiation that lasted less than 5 to 7 years. Which means that there will need to be a sort of interim arrangement which will have to be negotiated before we move to the cruise regime, which will be the new trade regime.
So we have a situation where Theresa May is saying, I don't want a bad deal. It's no deal rather than a bad deal. And what if there is no deal, and as Chris Cook says, we then fall back in WTO rules? One thing, first of all, you know, would this tariff of, for example, 10% on car imports to the EU apply to Britain automatically, first of all?
Yeah, that's a possibility if there's no deal. As you rightly say, you go back to WTO rules, but WTO rules are worse for UK and, by the way, for EU into the UK than a good deal. So this notion, you know, I've been a trade negotiator. This notion that no deal rather than a bad deal is something all trade negotiators have been saying all the time. The question is, if you have an option between going back to the WTO rules, which is 10 of pain, or a deal which is 4 of pain, you will choose the 4 of pain.
Now, just finally, you're very well aware, and you indeed know, Boris Johnson. Would you think he should be one of the kind of lead persons in negotiations, given what he said today that so offended so many French?
Look, what Boris Johnson said today leads me to wonder whether it's Donald Johnson or Boris Trump. It's a clear embarrassment for all these high-flying diplomats in the Foreign Office, and they deserve all our compassion.
Thank you very much indeed, Pascal Lamy.
I've been getting